isn't some kind of theoretical construct. That's pretty much the response, at least the polite version, that any reporter will get from an editor if he suggests, let's write a story about labor. And that's understandable, actually. Let's be clear. Labor has been basically in a free fall for a long time. It's losing power on all fronts, collective bargaining, politics, organizing. And once upon a time, conventional wisdom says labor was necessary. The conditions that gave rise to it made it that way. There was a time when employers took advantage of workers, when the government fronted for corporate interests, when the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, when immigrants were exploited. Well, thank you. When safety problems were rampant. But that was eons ago, people say, and now labor's lost its relevance. After all, those problems have largely been resolved. We now live in a sophisticated global economy. Things are properly regulated. Unless there be any doubts about that, just look at workers themselves. They're not joining unions. In fact, they're leaving in droves. They're voting with their feet. And so if the very people that labor is supposed to preserve, protect, and defend aren't interested, why should anybody else care about labor? And given that, why on earth write a book about labor? The short answer is because that conventional wisdom is, I think, almost entirely wrong. And it's really important that people understand why it is wrong, because that goes to the essence of a lot of what people feel is wrong about our country right now. Look at the factors I just mentioned about that gave rise to the labor movement about 100 years ago. And I think your laughter indicates that you understand that those things haven't changed very much. Rich getting richer and poor getting poorer. Right now, we have the biggest wage disparity that we've had since the Great Depression between rich and poor. We have the largest share of the GDP going to profits and the smallest going to wages that we've had since the 40s or 50s. Government fronting for corporate interests. Just look at the appointments and the policies of the Department of Labor today, which I examined in the book, the National Labor Relations Board, and other federal agencies, or look at our trade policy. As far as employers take advantage of workers, please tell people who've worked a lifetime for pensions, often making wage concessions, and now find those pensions in jeopardy, that they're getting a fair deal. As far as immigrants being exploited, it may be less visible now. It's no longer in sweatshops in New York City. You have to visit the meat packing plants or the poultry plants in the Midwest or the South to find that. Rampant safety problems. Now that is an area that's improved, admittedly, especially since OSHA was formed about 30 years ago. But this decade that's turned around. It's labor safety improvement has stopped, and in fact, in a couple of those years it's gone backwards. And look at what happened to miners last year. 47 miners were killed. The worst safety record for miners in over a decade. And none of that is coincidental. If you look at the activities of MSHA or OSHA, MSHA is the Miners Safety and Health Administration. And more broadly, we have enormous problems of economic insecurity. For the first time in our history, polls say that the average American doesn't feel his or her children will be better off than he or she was. And it's no coincidence, I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that this assault of the middle class has happened at the same time that labor's been declining. Nor is it any coincidence that when labor was at its strongest, from the late 40s to the mid-70s, that's the time of the greatest expansion of the middle class in this country's history. What people are doing, really, when they say labor is irrelevant, is they're confusing labor's weakness with labor's supposed irrelevance. They're conflating labor's inability to fill its role with the lack of that role. Labor's no less relevant today because it's weak. It's just that that weakness works in different directions. For example, during Katrina, and we all know how much media attention there was to Katrina, but very little focused on the president's policy with regard to prevailing wages. A few days after Katrina, he suspended Davis-Bacon Prevailing Wage Act for those workers who were going to clean up the Gulf. So in other words, at the very time that they were being devastated by the flood, they were also going to get paid less for cleaning and rebuilding. And that happened because labor is weak. And it's not just specific issues that make labor relevant.
They also outsource.
It's also
all the jobs.
A process. One of the reasons that our economy has been the envy of the world is because of our tripartite industrial relations system, where labor, management, and government have all had a say. And really the best policies have emerged because because of that vigorous debate of all voices being represented at the table. So you don't have to agree with anything labor stands for to think that it's important that labor's voice be heard. The industrial relations system would be just as imbalanced if management were shut out and labor had a dominant role. So I think the question about labor's relevance really shifts from whether it's still relevant to how it can strengthen itself institutionally so it can meet the challenges that it as a movement and that workers in middle-class Americans face. And that leads to a second part of the book, how well labor is doing in trying to revitalize itself. That's the second of 3 points I'll mention here briefly before we get to questions. And I'd submit not very well. For a long time, labor leaders were in denial that there was even anything wrong. And I think that's because they, on the one hand, didn't want to embolden their adversaries and also perhaps didn't want to embolden their rivals within the labor movement. So they claimed they were doing everything as well as they could and there were just some tough conditions out there. But 3 or 4 years ago, it became evident even to labor's leaders that something had to be changed. The numbers were continuing to plummet. They were in single digits in the private sector. And they just lost the 2004 election. They felt this was perhaps the most anti-union president in American history. And he was presiding at that point over a jobless recovery, in fact, a net job loss. And he was leading an unpopular war in Iraq. And yet they couldn't win, even though they put more resources into that election than they ever had. So in late 2004, 2005, they began a real, genuine process of introspection. They had meetings, sessions, public sessions with labor leaders, labor activists, intellectuals, scholars, rank and file members, even allowed some media in New York and in Washington. Unfortunately, nothing really came of that, I think, other than a split. In 2005, labor split apart into 2 competing federations. And I think it did that because none of the solutions being proposed really offered any hope of getting anywhere. Essentially, different labor leaders, different leaders of different unions said that the movement should focus on collective bargaining, should focus on politics, should focus on organizing. In other words, take one of the things we've been doing anyway and just do it better, just put more resources into it. And conveniently, each labor leader suggested that everybody follow what he had been doing anyway. Now the problem with that is that labor was ignoring the fact that it was really in a vicious cycle, a catch-22. It couldn't do any of those things because it was weak in all of them. Labor couldn't win elections because labor laws and labor policies were so stacked against it. It couldn't organize because of those policies, and it couldn't get anywhere. It was in downward plummet. So, absent any really encouraging ideas people could rally around, I think it became pretty much of a sort of sophomoric food fight, with personalities entering into it, personal ambitions mixed in, and the result is that labor's now done to itself what management couldn't do, which is ruin its solidarity. So, if labor is important, still relevant, but unable to turn things around, what can it do to rejuvenate itself? And this is the last point I'll make here, and this is what a lot of the book's about. And to boil down a good chunk of the book, I think there are 4 types of things labor needs to do. One is to engage in creative strategies that are really adapted to whatever situation it finds itself in, whether politics, collective bargaining, organizing, or whatever. Right now, unions, by and large, with some exceptions, tend to pull sort of a generic playbook off the shelf when they're in an election or when they're facing an employer in collective bargaining. And that worked when unions were really strong, when they had 35% of the workforce in the 50s. It doesn't work any longer, and yet a lot of unions still continue to go through the motions. Another thing I think labor needs to do is to engage full force in the values debate. I was fortunate enough to be in Pennsylvania before the 2004 election, Pennsylvania and Ohio, talking to blue-collar workers who were sort of torn between their economic interests on the one hand and their social values on the other hand. And I couldn't understand why, and I still don't understand why labor let that stand. Let workers see more importance in whether gays get married than in whether the family survives, and why they would call the former values and the latter simply issues.